This Ablandex policeman stands in a courtroom, his loyal canine guide dog by his side. The atmosphere is thick with tension, and everyone is waiting for his final words. But when his dog suddenly reacts in a way no one could have anticipated, the entire trial takes a shocking turn. This is a story of trust, intuition, and the extraordinary bond between a man and his dog. Stay tuned to witness how a blind man's faith in his companion uncovers the truth. The courtroom was a theater of muted whispers and darting glances as Jack Sullivan entered, his movements deliberate yet confident. Jack was a retired police officer, once hailed as one of the most skilled detectives in the city. But now Leff had dealt the man unimaginable blow. He had lost his sight in an accident during his last case. Despite this, Jack's presence commanded respect. His demeanor resolute. Beside him walked Max, his faithful German shepherd, who had transitioned from a canine officer to Jack's trusted guide dog. Their partnership had grown even deeper in the years following Jack's retirement. Max wasn't just eyes, she was his protector, his constant companion, and the one being Jack could always rely on. Jaxla had taken another cruel twist that was now on trial, accused of a serious crime. The case had divided opinions, with many struggling to reconcile the accusations with the decorated officer's reputation. Today, the trial had reached a pivotal moment. Jack had requested that Max be allowed in court not just as his guide, but because he believed his dog might hold the key to his defense. The judge is stern, yet fair woman granted the request with a touch of skepticism. Mrs. Sullivan, she began, "This is an unusual allowance. I trust you'll explain the relevance of your request." "Thank you, Your Honor." Jack replied, his voice a steady, butting edge with emotion. "Max and I have been through everything together. He's not just a dog, he's my partner, and I trust this instincts more than anything." As Max led Jack to his seat, the dog scanned the room, his nose twitching slightly. The courtroom fell silent. As everyone watched, Jack reached down, running his hand along Max's back, a gesture of reassurance for them both. The nith happened. Max, usually calm and composed, tensed. A low growl rumbled in his throat, his gaze locking onto a man seated at the prosecutor's tablet. The unexpected reactions and triples of shock through the room. Jack's head tilted, his expression serious. "Max," he murmured, his tone questioning. The dog's behavior wasn't random. It was deliberate. What had Max sensed? The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension as the unexpected growl from Max broke the silence. Jack's fingers instinctively tightened on the leash, sensing his dog's unusual alertness. The judge rapped her gavel lightly, calling for order. "Miss Sullivan," the judge's tone softened, but carried a note of concern. "Can you explain what's happening with your dog?" Jack hesitated. "Your Honor, Max has been trained to detect danger. He's never behaved like this without reason. I trust his instincts." The courtroom exchanged uneasy glances. The prosecutor, Miss Langston, stood with a smirk. "With all due respect to Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge, "we're only allowing a dog's growl to sway legal proceedings." Jack lifted his head, though his unseeing eyes stared straight ahead. "Max has saved my life more times than I can count," the said firmly. "If he's reacting, it's because something's not right." Max's growls softened into a low whine, his body tense, his gaze fixed on a man sitting a few rows behind the prosecution table. The man, dressed in a crisp gray suit, shifted uncomfortably under the dog's intense scrutiny. The judge, intrigued, turned her gaze to the man she addressed him. "Is there something you'd like to share?" The man, startled by the attention, stammered, "No, Your Honor. I'm just an observer who seems to have caught the attention of a highly trained canine." Jack interjected, his voice calm, but pointed. The courtroom fell silent again, the air thick with curiosity and unease. Max's history wasn't a mystery to anyone familiar with Jack's career. As part of the police force, Max had been trained to detect narcotics, explosives, and even human emotions like fear and aggression. His instincts had been honed over years of rigorous training and field work. Jack knew that Max's reaction wasn't arbitrary. It was a signal. The prosecutor tried to redirect the focus. "Let's not lose sight of the matter." Then he said, "Miss Sullivan is on trial for obstructing justice and tampering with evidence. This is not the time for distractions about what a dog might or might not have sensed." Jack remained silent, this hand steady on Max's harness, but internally his mind raced. Here called Maxima's post-alerts, each one leading to a breakthrough or saving lives. Was it possible that Max had detected something about the man in the gray suit? The judge addressed Jack again. "Miss Sullivan, your request to have Max here was highly unconventional, but I allowed it out of respect for your service. Do you believe his reaction is relevant to your defense, Your Honor?" Jack said confidently, "Max has an extraordinary ability to perceive what others might miss. I don't know what he's sensing, but I believe it's important. The judge considered this. "Mr. Langston," she said, turning to the prosecutor, "do you object to exploring this matter further?" Langston, visibly irritated, waved his hand dismissively. "If it'll satisfy the court, let's address the dog's behavior. But I don't see how it relates to the charges against Miss Sullivan." The judge nodded. "Very well, Mrs. Sullivan, I'll allow you to explain Max's reaction. but I warn you this must be directly relevant to the case." Jack nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor," turned his head slightly, speaking to Mac's soft, commanding tone. Mac, sit the dog, immediately obeyed, his body still alert but now seated beside Jack. Jack's fingers brushed the fur on Max's neck, grounding himself as she spoke. "Max has a history of detecting things no one else notices. Jack begging more than alerted meta concealed weapons, hidden drugs, even lies during interrogations. She can sense tension, fear, and guilt. I can't explain how it's just who is." The judge leaned forwards, lightly, her interest peaked. "And you believe he's sensing something now?" "Yes," Jack said firmly, "and I believe it's coming from that man." He pointed in the general direction of the man in the gray suit. The man's face turned pale as the attention of the entire courtroom shifted to him. "Your Honor," Jack continued, "I request that this man be identified," and questioned if Maxis reacting to him. "There's a reason, and that reason might be critical to my defense." The judge hesitated, clearly weighing the unusual request. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for her decision. "Bailiff." The judge finally said, "Please escort the man in the gray suit to the witness stand." The bailiff approached the man, who appeared increasingly nervous as she was led to the stand. Max's eyes never wavered. His body coiled. "Your name for the record," that the judge instructed. The man hesitated before speaking. "Michael Reyes," he said, his voice barely audible. "Miss," the judge said, her tone firm, "you are now under oath. I advise you to answer truthfully. Do you have any connection to this case?" Or the defendant Rye's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the stand. "I'm just there to observe," he stammered. Jack's instincts told him otherwise. Max's reaction wasn't coincidental, and Jack was determined to uncover the truth. The atmosphere in the courtroom. Weiss electrical eyes were on Michael Reyes, who now sat uneasily in the witness stand, his knuckles white, ace they gripped. The edge. Max's piercing gaze remained fixed on him, the low growl from earlier now replaced by an unsettling silence. The judge's voice broke the tension. "Miss Reyes, you've stated that you're here as an observer, but Miss Sullivan's service dog has shown an unusual reaction toward you. Given Miss Sullivan's history and Max's training, the court finds it necessary to investigate further. I advise you to be forthcoming in your responses." Michael swallowed hard. I don't know what this is about," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Jack's voice, calm but cutting, broke through. "Max doesn't react to just anyone. Ms. Reyes, I'd like to know why you're here today. Are you connected to the prosecutor's office, the police, or something else?" Reyes hesitated, his eyes darting toward the prosecutor. Langston, who was now shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Your Honor," Langston interjected, his tone sharp, "this is an unwarranted distraction. Mireille's presence here has no bearing on this case. We're allowing a dog's behavior to dictate legal proceedings, which is absurd," but the judge held up her hand, silencing him. "Miss Langston, you argued earlier that addressing this behavior would satisfy the court's concerns. We're now addressing it. Please refrain from interruptions." Jack leaned forwards, lightly, his sightless eyes directed at Reyes. "Observer, are your eyes?" His breathing quickened, and his shoulders slumped. "You work for a private investigation firm," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The judge rapped her gavel again. "Order, mister, or elaborate. What is your role, and why are you here today?" "I was sheared to dig up information on Miss Sullivan," Reyes confessed, his voice trembling. "By Mr. Langston." Langston shot at his feet. "Your Honor, I object. This is irrelevant and an unfounded accusation." The judge's sharp glare cut him off. "Sit down, Miss Langston," Ms. Reyes continued. Reyes sighed, visibly deflating. "I was tasked with uncovering anything that could discredit Mrs. Sullivan. My instructions were clear. Make sure the prosecution's case was airtight." Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "And what did you find?" Ms. Reyes hesitated, his face pale. "Nothing, at least nothing incriminating. That's why I'm here today. I was told to observe just in case of something useful came up during the trial." The judge's face hardened. "Miss Langston, is this true? Did you hire a private investigator to gather extraneous information on Miss Sullivan?" Langston's face flushed. "Your Honor, it is common practice to ensure a thorough case. There's nothing unethical about hiring investigators, except when it's done with the intent to manipulate the outcome of a trial." The judge interjected, her voice. "This court does not condone such behavior." Miss Langston considered this a warning. Jack's mind raced. His admission was significant, but it didn't explain Max's reaction. Head dressed Reese again. "Why did Max single you out? Is there something you're not telling us?" Reyes hesitated, sweat forming on his brow. "You don't know," is where Max shifted beside Jack, his ears pricking forward as if listening intently. Jack's grip tightened on the leash. "Max isn't convinced, and neither am I." The judge leaned forward. "Miss Reyes, the court demands full transparency. If you withhold any relevant information, you could face charge and obstruction of justice." Reese's shoulders slumped further. "There's one thing," he said reluctantly. "During my investigation, I was approached road by someone, a man. He offered memony to fabricate evidence against Miss Sullivan." It turned him down, but he was insistent aggressive. The judge's expression darkened. Who was this man? Reyes shook his head. I don't know his real name. He went by Dixon. He claimed to have connections that could make or break cases. The revelations sent another ripple through the courtroom. Jack's jaw tightened. Dixon had murmured, his mind flashing back to a name whispered during a past case involving police corruption. The judge addressed the court officers. Find this Dixon, Mr. Reyes. You are to remain in custody until further notice. This court needs to ensure your safety and verify your claims. Reyes nodded meekly, relief and fear evident on his face as the bait escorted Reyes from the stand. Max finally relaxed his body languages, offending Jack. Knelt beside him, running his hand through Max's "For good boy," he whispered, but as the courtroom settled, Jack knew this was only the beginning. The mention of Dixon had cracked open a door that led to dangerous territory. The implications were clear. Someone wanted Jack silenced, and they were willing to go to great lengths to do it. The courtroom buzzed with a mixture of unease and anticipation. As Reyes was escorted out, the judge called for a brief recess, allowing the tension to simmer while she reviewed the implications of the testimony. Jack sat quietly, his hand resting on Max's back, but his mind was far from still. Dixon, the name echoed in his thoughts, like a siren. Jack had come across that name years ago, whispered in dark corners of precincts during his time on the force. It was tied to a shadowy figure who operated within the gray zones of law enforcement, manipulating evidence, witnesses, and even entire cases. Dixon was a ghost known but never caught. As the court reconvened, Jack adjusted his posture, his sigh sterned toward the sound of the gavel. The judge's voice carried authority. This court will not tolerate interference with the judicial process. The integrity of this trial has been called into question, and we will get to the bottom of it. The prosecutor, Langston, looked visibly shaken but composed himself enough to address the court. Your Honor, while I disagree with Moraes' actions, there is no evidence tying me directly to this Dixon individual. I've never met or communicated with him. Jack's attorney, Sandra Mills, stood up. Your Honor, while Miss Langston denies involvement with Dixon, we must consider the possibility of a larger conspiracy at play. My client's history with uncovering corruption makes him a target. The judge nodded. Ms. Mills, does your client have any insight into who this Dixon might be? Jack leaned into the microphone, his voice steady but carrying a hint of frustration. Your Honor, Dixon is an ordinary man. He's a fixer. If he's involved, it's because someone powerful wanted this case compromised. The judge frowned. Do you have any evidence to support this claim? Miss Sullivan. Jack hesitated. No concrete evidence, but Max's reaction to Reyes wasn't random, and I have been through enough to trust this instinct, especially when it comes to danger. The judge acknowledged his statement with a measured and understood. This court takes these matters seriously. We will proceed cautiously. Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened, and a court officer entered, approaching the bench with urgency. He handed the judge a piece of paper. Here, expression darkened as she read. It appears we may have a lead on this Dixon officer. Stracked Reyes' last known communications and one number matches an ongoing investigation into organized corruption. Gasps rippled through the room. The judge addressed the court. This case has now expanded beyond its original scope. We must ensure the safety of all involved. I am placing this court under temporary adjournment while law enforcement investigates further. Miss Sullivan, you are advised to remain a protective watch. Jack frowned. Protective watch? What about Max and Mew? We've been through worse without guards. The judge's tongue. This is not our quest, Miss Sullivan. It's a precaution. As the gavel struck, signaling the adjournment, Jack felt a mix of frustration and unease. Being confined to protection wasn't this style. He preferred to face threats head-on, but he also knew this was no ordinary case. Jack sat in his modest apartment, the quiet hair of the city providing a faint backdrop. Max lay at his feet, his ears occasionally twitching as if sensing something. Miss Jack couldn't shake the feeling that events were spiraling out of control. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Max immediately sprang to attention, growling low. Jack moved cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the collar where Max's ID and tracker were secured. Who is it? Detective Ruiz came there. Jack relaxed slightly. Ruiz was one of the few officers she trusted. Opening the door, he greeted the detective who stepped in, her face lined with concern. We've got a problem. Jack, she said, lowering her voice that lead on Dixon's. It's bigger than we thought. This tied to multiple cases of judicial tampering and Rye's testimony puts a target on your back. You're not safe here. Jack sighed. When am I ever safe, Ruiz? She gave a faint smile, but quickly grew serious. This isn't a joke. We intercepted a message that suggests Dixon is already moving to cover his tracks, and you're on the list. Max growled softly, a Safin agreement. Jack knelt beside him, stroking his head. I'm not running. If Dixon wants to silence me, he'll have to face me. Ruiz frowned. Jackie, you're blind. You can't what? Jack interrupted, his voice firm. Survive? I've survived war, betrayal, and corruption, Max, and I don't need sight to fight. We need information. Ruiz hesitated, then handed Edim a file. You didn't get this from me, but it might help names, locations, everything. We've got on Dixon's network. Jack took the file, his fingers running over the Braille translations. She'd thoughtfully included, "Thanks, Ruiz. This means a lot." She nodded. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Jack smirked. "Careful's not my style," as she left, and Jack sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what lay ahead. Max nudged his hand, a silent reassurance that he wasn't alone. Together they'd faced impossible odds before. This time would be no different. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the glow of a desk lamp. Jack sat at this small kitchen table, the file. Detective Ruiz handed him, spread out before him. His fingers moved deftly over the Braille pages, absorbing every detail about Dixon's network. The more the pieces began to fall into place. Max lay at his feet, his head resting on Jack's boots, but his ears twitching every faint sound from the hallway outside. Jack could feel the tension radiating from his partner. Max was a mirror of his own emotions, one ready for anything. Jack leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "They think they can scare us," Max muttered, his voice low. Max raised his head, his sharp eyes meeting Jack's sightless ones. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." The file revealed Dixon's connections to several high-profile cases of corruption, implicating not only private investigators like Ruiz, but also law enforcement officers, legal professionals, and even politicians. Jack's gut twisted as she realized how deep this web of influences stretched. It wasn't just about him. This was a system designed to protect criminals and silence anyone who got in the way. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. He froze, his hand instinctively moving to Max's collar. "Max," he whispered, his tone signaling caution. Max immediately rose, his body tense as she positioned himself between Jack and the door. "Who is it?" Jack called, his voice steady. "It's Ruiz," came their reply, but something in the tone made Jack pause. It wasn't right. Too rushed, too anxious. Jack didn't move. "Ruiz, what's the code word?" Hesked, his voice sharp. Ruiz had insisted on establishing a code word earlier, knowing the risks of someone impersonating her. There was silence on the other side of the door, then a muffled curse. Jack's heart pounded as she grabbed Max's leash. "Time to move," him murmured, heading toward the fire escape in the back of the apartment. Max followed closely, his steps silent but purposeful. As they reached the window, Jack heard the sound of a lock being picked. Whoever was on the other side of that door wasn't wasting time. Jack slid the window open, the cold night air biting against his skin. Max jumped through, first landing on the metal grate with practiced ease. Jack followed, his movements quick and precise despite his lack of sight. Just as she closed the window behind him, the door burst open. Jack could hear heavy footsteps entering the apartment, the sound of drawers being yanked open and furniture being overturned. Whoever they were looking for something or someone. Jack and Max moved down the fire escape, their footsteps quiet against the metal as they reached the alley below. Jack paused, listening intently. The city sounds surrounded him, the distant thum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, the faint chatter of pedestrians, but closer he could hear the muffled voices of the intruders, now arguing among themselves. There another one of them growled, "Spread out, they couldn't have gotten far." Jack clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had to get a Ruiz or someone else he could trust. But staying in one place was too dangerous. He gave Max a signal, and the doggled him toward a side street away from the main road, where the intruders might have parked. As they moved through the shadow, Jack's thoughts turned. She been compromised, or worse, was she being held by Dixon's people? The idea made his blood run cold. Ruiz was one of the few Ollies he had left, and he couldn't afford to lose her. Max, his body rigid. Jack crouched beside him, his hand on the dog's shoulder. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Max's low growl was answer enough. Jack strained his ears and caught the faint sound of approaching footsteps. The intruder ERs had split up, and one of them was heading in their direction. Jack felt the cold steel of his service weapon tucked into the holster beneath his jacket. They hadn't used it in years, not since the incident that had taken his sight, but he was prepared to defend himself. And Max, if it came to it, the footsteps grew louder, then stopped. Jack could hearth. Intruder muttering, likely talking into a radio. No sign of him. The man said, "A K blind." How far could he have gotten? Jack smirked, a bitter sense of satisfaction washing over him. People always underestimate him because of his blindness. It was an advantage he'd learned to exploit. As the intruder moved on Jack, and Max slipped further into the alley, keeping to the shadows. They needed a plan, a way to turn the tables on Dixon and his network before things spiraled further out of control. Hours later, Jack and Max found refuge in an old safe house Jack had used during his time as an undercover officer. It was small and nondescript, tucked away in a forgotten corner of off the city. Jack locked the door behind the man, leaned against his chest. The aving as she caught this breath, Max sat beside him, his tail wagging faintly. Jack knelt down, resting his forehead against Max's. "Good boy," he murmured. "We'll figure this out together." As dawn broke, Jack sat at the small desk in the safe house, the file on Dixon spread out before him. Heck knew this fight was far from over, but with Max by his side and the truth starting to surface, he felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about many more. It was about exposing the corruption that had taken root in the system. He dances worn-up hold the early morning light, filtered through the dusty blinds of the safe house, casting faint patterns on the worn wooden floor. Jack sat at the small, his fingers running over the braille file Detective Ruiz had handed him. Max lay curled up near the door, his ears perked and his body poised, ready to react at the slightest sound. Jack's mind buzzed with the weight of what he'd uncovered. So far, Dixon's criminal network wasn't just about intimidation and bribery. It extended into human trafficking, weapons smuggling, and a string of unsolved homicides that had been dismissed as gang-related. The scope was staggering. And the deeper Jack delved, the clearer it became that the work of just one man, Dixon, was part of something much larger. A sharp knock at the door. Startled, Jack Max sprang to his feet, positioning himself protectively between Jack and the entrance. Jack reached his weapon, his senses heightened. "Who's there?" he called, his voice is steady but firm. It's Ruiz came, their reply, her voice low and urgent. Hesitated, the memory of the earlier break and fresh in his mind. "What's the code word?" he demanded. "Valor," she said without hesitation. Jack relaxed slightly to stand down, unlocked the door, and opened it cautiously. Ruiz stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. She closed the door quickly by behind her, scanning the room, as though expecting someone to follow. "What happened?" Jack asked, his tone sharper than I intended. Ruiz exhaled shakily. "They know I give you the files," she said, pulling a chair to the desk. "I barely made it out of the precinct. Dixon's people have ears everywhere." Jack clenched his jaw, the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "So what now? Do you have a plan, or are we just running in circles?" Ruiz hesitated before reaching into her bag and pulling out a second file. "This isn't just about Dixon anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The higher-ups, the ones funding him, they're tied to an offshore account. It's as lush fundused for bribery, extortion, and worse." Jack's fingers traced the braille on the cover of the new file. "And how to expose them without getting ourselves killed?" Hesked. "That's where we'll need help. I've reached out to someone who's been tracking this network for years, an investigative journalist named Lisa Marks. She's taking a huge risk by meeting us, but she believes in taking these people down as much as we do." Later that evening, Jack and Ruiz met Marks in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The journalist was younger than Jack had expected, her sharp features framed by short, dark hairs. She carried a leather satchel filled with notes, USB drives, and photographs. Lisa wasted no time diving into the details. "Dixon is small time compared to the people pulling the strings," she said, spreading a series of photographs on the table. "These are some of the key players' business. Executives, politicians, even a federal judge. They've built a system designed to protect themselves at all costs." Jack ran his fingers over the photographs, his expression grimed. "You're sure we can link them to Dixon?" Lisa nodded. "I've been working on this for years. I have documents, recordings, and whistleblower testimonies, but I've been waiting for the right moment to release it. All if we expose Dixon first, it'll create a domino effect. His arrest could force the higher-ups to scramble. And that's when we strike." Jack's mind raced as she absorbed the information. This was bigger than he had anticipated, and the risks were monumental. "What's our next move?" Lisa exchanged a glance with Reed. "To get Dixon's confession. If he implicates the people above him, we'll have enough to take this to the FBI." Jack, Ruiz, and Lisa spent the next several hours devising a plan. The goal was simple in theory, but dangerous in execution. Lure Dixon into a situation where he'd feel cornered enough to talk. Ruiz suggested using an old informant from her precinct, a man named Carlos who had a history with Dixon and might be willing to help in exchange for immunity. The team agreed to stage the meeting at an isolated location, with Jack and Max providing backup while Ruiz and Carlos confronted Dixon. Lisa would stay nearby, ready to document the interaction and ensure they had solid evidence as the plan took shape. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing a dangerous game. Dixon wasn't just a criminal, he was a desperate man, backed into a corner. People like didn't go down without a fight. With the plan in place, Jack and Ruiz parted ways, with Lisa agreeing to regroup the following evening as Jack and Max walked back to the safe house. Jack's thoughts turned to the risks ahead. He knew the stakes were high, not just for him but for everyone involved. Max nudged Jack's legs, sensing his unease. Jack reached down to ruffle the dog's fur, a small gesture of comfort. "We get through this, boy," he murmured. "Wheelways do." As they approached the safe house, Jack's phone buzzed. It was a text from Ruiz. "Change of plans. Meet the docks at midnight. Trust noon." Jack's heart sank as she read the message. The game was changing faster than he had anticipated. He had no choice but to keep up. The docks at midnight were a place of shadows and whispers. The faint scent of salt water mingled with the matango of red cargo containers. Jack stood at the edge of the pier, his posture rigid. Max sat by his side, his ears twitching at every creak and groan of the old wooden boards beneath their feet. Jack's mind was a whirlwind of questions. Why the sudden change of plans? What had Ruiz discovered that warranted such urgency? And could it trust her completely? The stakes had climbed too high. For mistakes or misplaced trust, a pair of headlights sliced through the darkness, the hum of an engine growing louder as a black San approached. Jack tensed his hand, resting lightly on Max's harness. When the car stopped, Detective Ruiz stepped out, her face drawn and pale under the glow of a single dockside lamp. "Jack," she called softly, glancing around the deserted docks. "Over here." Jack approached cautiously, Max moving in perfect sync with him. "What's going on?" "Ruiz, this better." "Not beach trap." Ruiz shook her head, her expression grave. "It's worse than we thought. Dixon's men are onto US. They've put a price on your head and mine." Jack felt a cold chill run down his spine. "How did they find out?" "I don't know," Ruiz admitted, "but the journalist Lisa, she's in danger too. They tried to ambush her an hour ago. She barely escaped and is now in hiding." Jack clenched his fists, his frustration mounting. "So what's the play, Dow or Unordau fight back?" Ruiz hesitated, then opened the trunk of her car. Inside was a duffel bag filled with weapons, burner phones. "If we don't act now, Dixon's going to slip through our fingers. She's planning to leave the country tomorrow morning." Jack's brow furrowed. "What's your plan?" We force his hand. Ruiz said, "We know where he's meeting his associates tonight, a warehouse on the south side. If we can corner him there and get Toko, we can expose the entire network. But it's risky, and we'll be outnumbered." Jack's mind raced. The idea of storming a warehouse filled with armed men was a gamble, but letting Dixon escape was unthinkable. His resolve hardened as she looked down at Max, who was watching Ruiz intently. "You're asking me to walk into a death trap," Jack said finally. "But if it means stopping Dixon, I'm in, Max, and I will cover you." As they prepared for the operation, Jack felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Ruiz handed him his Moliere piece and a pistol, her expression a mix of determination and guilt. "I know I'm asking a lot," she said quietly, "but we don't have anyone else to trust." Jack nodded, his voice low. "This isn't about you or Ruiz, it's about justice. It's about making sure no one else suffers because of people like Dixon." For a moment, the two shared an understanding. They were both risking everything: careers, lives, reputations, for a cause that might not even succeed. As they drove toward the warehouse, Ruiz briefed Jack on the layout and their plan. "Max will be crucial," she said. "His training could give us the edge we need." Jack reached down to scratch Max behind the ears. "She's more than just a dog," Jack said softly. "He's my partner, my eyes when I can't see, and he's never let me down." Ruiz smiled faintly. "Good, because tonight we'll need all the help we can get." The warehouse loomed ahead, its corrugated metal walls reflecting the faint glow of distant city lights. Jack and Ruiz parked their car a safe distance away and approached on foot, Max leading the way with his nose low to the ground. They paused at the edge of a shipping container yard, the warehouse's entrance. In sight, "Dixon's in there," Ruiz whispered, pointing to a row of SUVs parked outside. "We need to get them a one." Jack's jaw tightened. "Make it count." Ruiz moved stealthily toward the warehouses, signaling for Jack and Max to follow. The air was thick with tension as they positioned themselves outside a side entrance. Inside, the murmur of voices and the occasional clang of metal echoed through the cavernous space. Jack listened intently, his other senses sharpening. In the absence of sight, he could hear Dixon's distinct voice barking orders. At this meant the man was confident, too confident for someone about to be cornered. Ruiz gave Jack an hand on the door handle. "Ready," she mouthed. Jack gripped Max's harness, his heart pounding. "Let da this." The door creaked open, just enough for Jack, and Max and Ruiz to slip inside. The warehouse interior was dimly lit, shadows dancing across the walls. From the swinging overhead lights, the air smelled of oil, rust, and cigarette smoke, punctuated by the faint buzz of fluorescent fixtures. Tension was palpable. Dixon's voice cut through the murmur of his men. "This shipment needs to disappear by dawn. No mistake, sorry. You'll regret it." If his tone was cold, commanding, a stark reminder of the power he wielded. Jack crouched low, relying on Max's subtle movements to guide him. The dog's training shown it through every step was silent. Every paused. Elaborate. Ruiz followed close behind here, yes, scanning for threats. They edged closer to the source of the voices. Jack could make out at least 4 distinct figures, their silhouettes visible through the slats of a stack of crates. Dixon stood near a table covered in documents, his bodyguards flanking him. Ruiz leaned toward Jack, her whisper barely audible. "We need him to incriminate himself. If we just storm in, it'll be his word against ours." Jack nodded. "Then let's give him enough rope to hang himself." Ruiz gestured toward a row of stacked barrels to their left. "If we can get closer to that corner, I can record his conversation. You stay here with Max Beretti. If things go south." Jack hesitated. He hated the idea of Ruiz putting herself in danger, but he understood the necessity. "Be careful," his voice low but firm. Ruiz gave a tight nod and slipped into the shadowshare, movements as fluid as a predator stalking its prey. Jack stayed behind, his hand resting on Max's harness. The dog remained alert, this ear swiveling to catch every sound. As Ruiz moved into position, Dixon's tongue shifted. "We've got a leak," he said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "One of you idiots let something slip, and now I've got cops sniffing around." Jack stiffened, his grip on Max tightening. Ruiz paused, pressing herself against the side of a crate. Her phone was in her hand, the screen dimmed as she recorded every word. Dixon continued, "If find out who's responsible, they'll wish they'd never been born. Until then, West, stick to the plant. The shipment leaves tonight. No matter what." One of the bodyguards spoke up. "What about that journalist? She's still a problem." Dixon laughed coldly. "Not for long. I've got someone taking care of her." As we speak, Ruiz's eyes widened at the revelation. She glanced back at Jack, her expression urgent. Jack couldn't see her, but he could sense the shift in her energy. Something had changed. Max let Tautalo grow, almost imperceptible, but to make Jack tense. "What is it?" "Boy," he whispered before Ruiz could relay what she'd heard. The situation took a sudden turn. One of Dick's Minari figure with sharp features started moving toward the area where Ruiz was hitting. "Hey, did you hearth that?" the man said, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. Ruiz froze, her body pressed against the crate. She held her breath, willing herself to remain unseen. Jack's pulse quickened. He could sense the impending danger. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. Max shifted slightly, his body taut, and ready. The man rounded the corner, his flashlight sweeping over the crates. Ruiz ducked just in time, the beam narrowly missing her, but as she moved, her foot brushed against a loose piece of metal, sending it clattering to the ground. "Who's there?" The man barked, drawing his weapon. Ruiz bolted, making a beam for Jack and Max. The man shouted, alerting the others. Dixon turned, his eyes narrowing as she grabbed a pistol from the table. "Find them," he snarled, "and don't let them leave this warehouse alive." The quiet tension exploded into chaos. Dixon's men spread out their flashlights, cutting the darkness. Jack knew they couldn't rely on stealth any longer. "Max, go," Jack commanded, releasing the dog. Max sprang into action, his powerful frame darting toward the nearest assailant. The man barely had time to react before Max knocked him to the ground, his growl lachoing through the warehouse. Jack followed Ruiz's hurried footsteps, his cane tapping lightly as she navigated the chaotic scene. "Ruiz, where are you?" "Here," she called, her voice cutting through the noise. She grabbed Jack's arm, guiding him toward a stack of metal barrels. "We're outnumbered. Jack, we need backup." Jack clenched his jaw. "We don't have time to wait. If Dixon gets away, this whole operation is for nothing." As the chaos unfolded, Dixon made his move. He slipped through a side door, flanked by his remaining bodyguards. Ruiz saw him and cursed under her breath. "He's running." Jack turned his head toward the sound of the doors slamming shut. "Max," he called. The dog responded immediately, racing back to his side. "We're going after him," Jack said, his tone brooking no argument. Ruiz hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Let tune and this." Jack, Ruiz, and Max bolted toward the side door Dixon had used for his escape. The warehouse erupted in pandemonium as Dixon's remaining men scrambled to maintain control. Flashlights and shouts ricocheted across the cavernous space, but Jack and Ruiz stayed focused on their target, bursting through the door. The trio found themselves in an alleyway, bathed in the eerie glow of a flickering streetlight. The air was thick with the smell of damp asphalt and oil, and the distant hum of the city provided a tense backdrop. Jack gripped Max's harness tightly. "Which way?" hesked his urgent. Ruiz scanned the area, her sharp eyes catching a glimpse of taillights disappearing around a corner. "Over there," she said, Jack's arm. "He's getting into a car." Max let out a low bark, already straining to follow the scent of their quarry. Jack trusted his companion, implicitly lead the way. Max, the dog, surged forward, his powerful strides pulling Jack along as Ruiz ran beside them. The group rounded the corner just in time to see Dixon's sleek black SUV speeding down the road. As they reached the main street, a familiar voice called out from behind them, you need a ride." Jack and Ruiz turned to see Officer Daniels' cruiser, parked haphazard at the curb. He had heard the commotion over the radio and come to assist. Ruiz didn't hesitate. "Yes, Dixon's trying to get away." "Gettin'," Daniels howled, throwing open the car doors. Jack and Max climbed into the back seat while Ruiz slid into the front. Daniels shit the gas to tire, screeching as the cruiser lurched forward. Dixon's SUV weaved through traffic, its driver making reckless turns in an attempt to lose them. Daniel stayed close, expertly navigating the streets. Ruiz gripped the dashboard. "Here, he is locked on the vehicle. Ahead, he's heading toward the industrial districts," he said, her voice is steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Jack leaned forward, his hand resting on Max's back for reassurance. "We can't let them disappear into those warehouses. She'll vanish for good." Daniels nodded grimly. "Hold on, this is about to get Getro." He swerved sharply, cutting through an intersection. Just as the light turned red, horns blared, but the cruiser stayed on Dixon's tail. Max growled softly, his keen senses attuned to the rising tension as they closed in on the industrial district. Dixon's driver made a desperate move. The SUV veered onto a narrow side street, its tires skidding on the wet pavement. Daniels followed the cruisers, sirens wailing through the night. The chase led them deeper into a labyrinth of abandoned factories and loading docks. The area was eerily quiet. The shadows deepened. Foreboding. Dixon's SUV came to a sudden stop and the doors flew open. Dixon and his bodyguard spill, taking cover behind a row of rusted containers. Daniels killed the engine and turned to Ruiz. This is where it gets tricky. Are you armed? Ruiz nodded, pulling a compact pistol from her holster always. Jack tightened his grip on Max's harness. We've got this. Max can flush them out. Daniels hesitated, then nodded. Be careful. Ruiz and Daniels took cover behind a stack of pallets, their weapons drawn. Jack crouched low, his hand brushing against Max's fur. The dog was vibrating with energy, ready to act. Jack gave a low command. Dixon. Max moved like a shadow, his straining evident in every step. Darted between the container, his keen nose leading him straight to the group. One of Dixon's bodyguards spotted him and shouted, raising his weapon. Before Heck could fire, Max lunged, his powerful jaws locking onto the man's arm. Ruiz seized the opportunity, stepping out of cover to disarm the bodyguard. With a precise shot to his shoulder, the man crumpled his weapon, clattering to the ground. Dixon shouted orders, his voice frantic. Fall back, get to the docks. Jack, guided by Max's signals, advanced cautiously. He could hear Dixon panic breathing, the sound of footsteps retreating over. Gravely, you're running out of places to hide, Dixon called out. It's over as Ruiz and Daniels moved to cut off Dixon's escape. He made a last-ditch attempt to negotiate. You don't understand, he shouted, his voice echoing through the industrial maze. This isn't just about me if I gown. I'm taking a lot of people with me. Ruiz scoffed. You think that scares Sussy? You're going down either way. Dixon laughed bitterly. You're chasing me. But you don't even know the half of it. That file I destroyed, it wasn't just evidence. It was a list of everyone involved, politicians, CEOs. People you'd never dream of accusing. Ruiz paused, her grip tightening on her weapon. Jack furrowed his brow, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He's stalling. Jack said, don't let them distract you. But Ruiz couldn't shake the weight of Dixon's words if he was telling the truth. Their mission had just become much more complicated. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Dixon's words hung in the air, casting doubt and sowing unease. Ruiz's mind raced, weighing the implications of what he had said. Could there really be a network of powerful individuals shielding him? And if so, how far would they got to protect their secrets? While Ruiz and Daniels processed the gravity of Dixon's revelation, Max had not faltered. His keen nose followed Dixon's scent, leading Jack through the maze of containers and rust machinery. Jack relied on the subtle tugs of Max's harness, his senses heightened by years of training with the dog. Max, steady, Jack whispered as they rounded a corner. The faint sound of gravel crunching underfoot signaled they were close. Jack could feel Dixon's desperation in the air. Predator corner and ready to lash out ahead. Dixon stopped abruptly, realizing he had no clear escape route. He turned, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and fear, and then leveled a gun in Jack's direction. Stay back. Dixon barked, his voice trembling. I'll shoot, don't think I won't. Jack froze, his hand instinctively tightening on Max's. Dixon, you're out of options, Jack said, his voice calm but firm. Put the weapon down. This doesn't have to end badly. Dixon laughed bitterly. You think you've won, you know what you're up against. If you think taking me down will solve anything, you're more naive than. A thought before Jack could respond. Ruiz emerged from the shadows, her weapon trained on Dixon. Drop it. Dixon, she commanded. We've got you surrounded. Dixon's eyes darted between Jack and Ruiz, calculating his next move. You're making a mistake. His neared. You take mean, and they'll bury this whole thing. You'll be lucky if you keep your jobs better to take that chance than let you walk. Ruiz retorted, now drop the gun. Dixon hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. Max growled low, his body tense and ready to strike. Jack could feel the vibration of Max's energy and knew the dog was waiting for the command to act. The standoff stretched into agonizing seconds. Dixon's hand wavered, his resolve crumbling under the weight of the situation. You don't understand, he said, his voice cracking. I'm not the worst of them. If you take me out, you'll be opening Pandora's box. Ruiz didn't flinch. We'll deal with that when the time comes. Right now. You're the problem in front of me. Last chance. Dixon dropped the gun. Dixon's shoulders sagged, his bravado finale giving way to defeat. Slowly he lowered the weapon and let it clatter to the ground. Ruiz moved in, swiftly kicking the gun away and securing him in handcuffs. You've made the right choice, she said, though her voice was devoid of sympathy. But don't think for a second that you're walking out of this clean as. Ruiz and Daniels led Dixon back toward the waiting squad cars. He's murked. You think this is over? It's just beginning. The people I work for, they'll come for you. And when they do, you'll wish you'd left me in that warehouse. Ruiz tightened her grip on Dixon's arm. Let them come, we'll be ready. Jack remained quiet, his mind churning with questions. Dixon's cryptic warning hinted at a larger conspiracy, one that could have far-reaching consequences. For now, thought they had secured their target. Max stayed close to Jack's side, his presence a steadying force. Jack knelt down, running his hand over Max's head. Good work, buddy, he murmured. The dog nuzzled against them, his tail wagging softly despite the chaos. Max had what he was trained to do, protect and assist. Ruiz glanced over at Jack. "We couldn't have done this without Max," she said. "He's incredible." Jack smiled faintly. "He's more than that, he's my partner." As the team secured Dixon in a police vehicle, Ruiz's phone buzzed with a message from the forensic team. "We've recovered the destroyed documents from the warehouse." The message reads, "Several pages are salvageable. Looks like there's a list of names." Ruiz showed the message to Jack. "Your expression." Grim Dixon wasn't lying. "There's a bigger game." Play here." Jack nodded his jaw. "Set then we play to win." The squad cars pulled away from the warehouse district, their flashing lights casting long shadows across the abandoned buildings. Dixon sat in the back of one vehicle, his cuffed hands resting in his lap hand, unsettling smirk playing on his lips. It was the expression of a man who knew secrets and enjoyed holding the move of others. Ruiz rode in the car ahead of him, her minds whirling with thoughts about the evidence recovered, and Dixon's cryptic warnings. She glanced at their phone, rereading the forensic team's message about the names found in the documents. Each name represented a potential piece of a much larger puzzle. If Dixon's telling the truth, she muttered to herself, this could blow everything wide open. In another car, Jack sat quietly with Max at his side. Their rhythmic sum of the tires on the road was a stark contrast to the adrenaline-fueled chaos of the chase. Here stood his hand on Max's harness, drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence. Jack's thoughts drifted Dixon's taunts about the corrupt system protecting him. "We've taken him down, Max," Jack said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "But what if that's just the start? How deep does this go?" Max responded with a low, reassuring whine, as if to say, "We'll handle it together." The convoy was halfway to the police precinct when the lead car's radio crackled with an urgent alert. Roadblock ahead, unmarked vehicles reported in the area. "Proceed with caution." Ruiz's stomach tightened. "This isn't right," she said to the driver who ordered the roadblock. Before the officer could respond, a black van screeched into view, cutting off the convoy. Simultaneously, two other vehicles blocked them. From behind, trapping them in a narrow stretch of roadmen in tactical gear, poured out of the vans, that faces obscured by masks. They moved with military precision weapons drawn. "It's an ambush," Ruiz shouted, drawing her weapon. "Protect Dixon, he's their target." The officers scrambled to form a defensive perimeter around the vehicles, but the attackers were well coordinated, and heavily armed gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing in the confined space. Jack crouched low, his hand firmly on Max's harness. "Stay down, boy," he whispered. "We're not done yet." Took charge, barking orders to the officers while returning fire. She moved with calculated precision. Herman focused on one objective, keeping Dixon alive. If these men were here to silence him, it meant this information was more valuable than they'd realized amidst the chaos. Jack knew they needed an edge. "Max, search," he commanded, releasing the dog. Max darted into action, his sharp instincts cutting through the confusion. He weaved between cars and attackers, his low growl warning to anyone in his path. One of the assailants spotted Max and aimed his weapon, but the dog was too quick. With a powerful leap, Max latched onto the man's arm, forcing him to drop the gun. The commotion provided Ruiz with an opening to neutralize the attacker with whelp midst of the firefight. Dixon's a one opportunity. With the officers distracted, he slipped out of the back seat and began running toward the woods lining the road. His hands were still cuffed, but his desperation drove him forward. Ruiz caught sight of him and cursed under her breath. "Dixon's making a run for it," she shouted. "Jack, can you on it?" Jack interrupted, already in motion. Max after him. Max took off like a missile, his training kicking in. As she tracked Dixon's scent through the underbrush, Jack followed, guided by Max's movements and the sounds of branches snapping underfoot. Dixon stumbled through the dense forest. This breathing ragged, he tripped over a fallen log, landing hard on the ground before he could get up. Max appeared standing over him with a low, menacing growl. Dixon froze, his eyes wide with fear. "Call him off," Dixon shouted, his voice cracking. "I'll talk. I'll tell you everything." Jack emerged moments later, his figure silhouetted against the moonlight filtering through the trees. She held his cane in one hand, his other resting on Max's back. "You had your chance to cooperate." "Dixon," Jack said, his voice steady now. "It's honor terms." Dixon's brow crumbled. "Okay, just get this dog away from me." Jack gave a command and Max backed off slightly, his watchful gaze never leaving. Dixon Ruiz arrived shortly after, her gun drawn. "Don't move." He edged sharply Dixon's ankles for good measure back on the road. The ambush had been neutralized. Officers secured the attackers, their vans, and the weapons cache. They'd brought Ruiz radioed for backup to extract them from the areas. Afully, when Jack and Ruiz returned with Dixon, the defeated man muttered under his breath, "You don't know what you're dealing with. This isn't over." Ruiz smirked. "You're right, Dixon, it's just getting started." The convoy arrived at the police precinct under heavy security. Despite their enforcement, tension lingered in the air. Officers surrounded the area, their eyes scanning for any sign of additional threats. Dixon, now thoroughly subdued, was escorted inside, his smirk replaced by a grim expression. Jack stood beside Ruiz, his hand resting on Max's harness. The dog, though calm, remained alert. This ear perked as if sensing that the danger wasn't entirely over. Ruiz glanced at Jack. "We've got them, but this isn't the end," she said, her voice laced with determination. Dixon's network is extensive, as she claims this might just be the tip of the iceberg. Jack nodded. "That's why we have to play this smart." He's scared now, which means we've got leverage inside the interrogation room. Dixon sat across from Ruiz and another detective, his cuffed hands resting on the cold steel table. Jack and Max observed from behind the one-way glass. The former officer's ears tuned to every word. Ruiz leaned forward, her tone sharp but composed. "Cut the games. Dixon, you're facing charges that will bury you. But we both know you're not the mastermind here. Help us dismantle this operation and we might be able to cut you a deal." Dixon's coughed, his eyes darting nervously. "You think you can just take them down? You have no idea how powerful they are. They'll come for me." You Ruiz didn't flinch. "Let them try. We're not the ones in handcuffs. You have one chance to cooperate." Dixon hesitated, the weight of his predicament evident in his slumped shoulders. After a long pause, he began to speak, his voice low and cautious. "He named names, detailed operations, and described safe houses and covert communication methods." Ruiz's pen moved furiously across her notebook, capturing every detail behind the glass. Jack listened intently, his mind raced with memories of the cases she'd worked, connections forming like puzzle pieces. Max rested his head on Jack's lap, a grounding presence amidst the storm of information. As the interrogation continued, Dixon dropped a bombshell. "There's a list," said his voice barely of a whisper, "a list of officials on their payroll, judges, politicians,